Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started as people keep joining. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Yonit Behar, and I'm the assistant curator at DePaul Art Museum. It is snowing so much here in Chicago, so wherever you are today, I hope you are staying warm and comfortable. Today's program on Latinx Inclusivity is planned in conjunction with our exhibition Latinx American, which you can visit online on our website. The exhibition features the work of 38 Latinx artists from across the US and Puerto Rico and assesses the presence and absence of Latinx artists in our museum collection, reflecting on efforts to build in this area. The work of today's presenters, Ed Morales and Arlene Dávila, precisely tackles questions around inclusivity. Where do we go from here with Latinidad in the midst of US reckoning with race, they ask. I would like to now particularly thank DePaul's Departments of Latin American and Latino Studies, History of Art and Architecture, and the Center for Latino Research, as well as the Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts for their support with this program. Our speakers today will give short presentations, then they'll be in conversation with each other. And at the end, we will have time for your questions. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat box and I'll make sure to read them out loud at that time. Now, let me introduce you to our fantastic speakers. Ed Morales is an author and journalist who has written for The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian. He was staff writer at the Village Voice and columnist at Newsday. He is the author of Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico, Latinx, The New Force in Politics and Culture, and Living in Spanglish. In 2019, his book Latinx was shortlisted for the Global Cultural Understanding Prize by the British Academy in London. Morales wrote and directed Whose Barrio, an award-winning documentary about the gentrification of East Harlem. Morales is also a lecturer at Columbia University's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race and the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Arlene Dávila is a professor of anthropology and social and cultural analysis at New York University and founding director of the Latinx Project at NYU. She studies the political economy of culture and media, consumption, immigration, and the geographies of inequalities and race. She has authored 6 books, among them Latino Spin, Public Image and the Whitewashing of Race, Culture Works, Space Value and Mobility Across the Neoliberal Americas, and Latinx Art, Artists, Markets, and Politics. Our moderator tonight is Bill Johnson González, who is an associate professor in the English department at DePaul, director of DePaul Center for Latino Research, and editor-in-chief of the interdisciplinary journal Diálogo. Bill has published articles on multilingualism in Latinx literature, queer Latinx film, and cinematic representations of the Bracero program. He is currently working on a translation of a historical novel written by Bracero. Bill regularly teaches courses on Latinx literature, literary theory, and queer studies. He is a co-editor of the volume Passing Lines, Immigration and Sexuality, and the Surprise of Otherness, Barbara Johnson Reader. With that, now I will turn it over to Ed Morales, who will begin with his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. All right, well, thank you, Yonit and Bill, and of course, Arlene. I have some prepared remarks, but I'll improvise as I check my notes. I'm very happy to be here. You know, it's too bad that I'm not in Chicago. I really enjoyed being in Chicago last time I was there, and it's such an important city, particularly for politics, but obviously we're talking about culture tonight. So let me just talk a little bit about what I try to do with my book, Latinx, the New Force in American Politics and Culture. You know, my book, it tries to show how the identity of Latin American descendants, which is, I'm going to use that phrase because I don't want to, affiliate myself with Latinx or Latino too strongly in the US. And this identity is most effective for me in cultural production when it focuses on racial difference. Representations of Blackness and Indigenousness have often been at the center of music, literature, theater, and performance art that I have consumed, particularly Nuyorican bilingual poetry and Afro-Cuban jazz and bomba en plena. And this kind of cultural work is what most attracted me to identify as Latinx, or to identify with a broader label like Latino, because there are so many different people who are engaged in this cultural production. I also want to talk about why Latin American descendants are obscured or made invisible in media representation and political analyses. The enormous diversity of our racial identities makes it difficult, if not impossible, for writers and analysts formed by US binary ideas of race and culture to describe or interpret. While this invisibility can be difficult for career building in the media and the arts specifically, the lack of a defined expectation of who they should be, in some senses, frees Latin American descendants to have more control over how they define themselves and less apt to be co-opted by mainstream media controls and imperatives. That said, it's really important, the discussion that's going on today about the feasibility of a unified Latinx label. I find a lot of parallels with the questioning of the term people of color. Not all people of color suffer the same level of discrimination, and that's similar for Latinx people. There is a series of well-founded criticisms from Black and Indigenous Latin American descendants that mestizaje discourse from Latin America suggests that there is a racial democracy, when there's a clear racial hierarchy that has whiteness and Blackness at opposite points. And I'm talking about Latin America. With Indigenous perhaps a little closer to Blackness than whiteness, Indigenousness. It's important to refuse mestizaje as a valid way to structure our idea of Latinidad in the US. But it's equally important to see that it does not necessarily determine it, and that through the interaction of Latinx and the US's clearly drawn racial Black-white binary, there's a possibility to turn mestizaje on its head. This really results from me looking at the history of the national liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, and even before that, going back to the 30s, when Latino groups tried to have unified conversation, and it was around, it was for different purposes than for targeting oneself in the consumer market. I use the word Latinidad to open a discussion that seeks to define it. What is Latinidad and who defines it? The term originated with academics trying to fashion a coherent view of characteristics shared by migrants and immigrants from different parts of Latin America, independently of labels like Hispanic and Latino. The original attempts, as I just described, often had a dynamic, progressive purpose. For instance, in Benjamin Francis Fallon's recent book, The Rise of the Latino Vote, he talks about the efforts of Mexican-American labor organizer Luisa Moreno, whose popular front-style organization, El Congreso de Pueblos de Habla Española, established in 1939, reached out to Puerto Ricans and other Latinx who lived in the East, trying to unite farm workers in Texas with Puerto Rican garment workers in New York and Cuban cigar factory workers in Tampa, Florida. In historian Joanna Fernandez's recent book, The Young Lords of Radical History, she wrote that for the Young Lords, Latino was a term always linked to a vision of self-determination, namely Puerto Rico's fight for independence, Chicanos' desire to control their own land, and the Dominican Republic's fight against US domination through puppet generals, as well as the liberation struggles in Latin America. She also stresses in her book that the majority of the leaders of the Young Lords identified as Afro-Latinx, and that one of its key members, Denise Oliver, was an African-American who attended historically Black university, Howard University. Through a process that my colleague, Professor Arlene Dávila, described in her books, Latinos Inc. and Latino Spin, neoliberalism seized on these earlier grassroots attempts at unity to turn Latinidad into a whitewashing project. This involved flattening individual national identities, erasing Black and Indigenous people, and reimposing suffocating patriarchal structures on the agency of women and queer people. This process has created the Latinidad of the moment. But much of the dialogue that I hear acts as if Latinidad, almost like capital, is this uncontrollable thing that has a determined colonial aspect to it. For me, the Latinx identity is a chance for people of Latin American descent to create political and cultural coalitions with each other in a way that recognizes common struggles. It's a way to express the growing importance of the intersectional nature of those struggles. Latinx can potentially undermine the problems with nationalism that have to do with patriarchy and male supremacy in a kind of a contradictory way. I wrote an article in The Nation in 2019 where I called the movement to depose Ricardo Rosselló, Puerto Rico's governor, as a form of intersectional nationalism because women and queer people played a central role in defining Puerto Rico's national identity. It was a form of Puerto Rican X, you might say. I'm proud, as I've mentioned in other commentaries, that the Latinx community is the first ethno-racial community in the US to recognize the importance of the inclusion of LGBTQIA people. In an interesting way, Latinx identity parallels queer identity in the way that it embraces difference as a form of identity. In his posthumously released book, The Sense of Brown, Jose Munoz describes brown, his formulation of the intersection of Latinidad with queerness, as a feeling together in difference. I don't necessarily agree with brown as a foundational identity, but the word has its symbolic purpose. In a sense, Latinx identity challenges the idea of identity itself around the essentialisms or stereotypes that narrow our range of possibilities. Crude essential notions about who we are, used by Jessica Krug, a white professor from Kansas, to masquerade as a Black Puerto Rican woman, and at the same time unnoticed by a string of white academics, was key to analyzing her case. Essentialized identities are another way marginalized people are trapped by dominant white supremacist forces and institutional structures. In the midst of this surge in authoritarian white supremacy, which has not gone away if you're following the news lately, we're in a moment where a kind of Latinx politics is manifesting itself. More and more candidates, political elected officials, most noticeably Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, are using multiple intersectional identifications as women, queer, Puerto Rican, Latinx, and possessing a class consciousness by identifying with working people. AOC herself seemingly solves the conflict that appeared after the 2016 election. She embodies the Black feminist identification of Kamala Harris voters, the social class politics of Bernie Sanders, the social media savvy of millennials, and the quest for Puerto Rican self-determination. To my surprise, I have no background in art criticism and often consider myself an indistinguished evaluator of visual art. I've been asked to speak at a lot of art-centric events, from a gathering at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts to the Whitney, to Latinx US Futures at Bronx Museum, Smack Mellon Gallery in Brooklyn, Museo del Barrio in Harlem. Visual artists seem to have an interest in the idea of Latinx identity as expressing different and multiple identifications. Different strands of Latin American identity can manifest themselves in the visual work, either through direct representation or abstract concept. I see it a little bit in the way I view music, which Arlene brought up before we went on, which I've written a lot about, in the way that different layers of identity can exist in one coherent work of cultural production. It seems that the idea of mixture or racial difference has resonance, particularly during a time when whiteness is desperately trying to recenter itself as a hegemonic force. That's what we're seeing now in our politics. But of course, mixture is a tricky ground to stand on. That sense of mixture must always be aware that Latinx, our sense of mixture, must always be aware that Latinx are not separate from Black and Indigenous divisions, from Black and Indigenous people, and divisions between Latinx and African Americans are often arbitrary in nature, and that the communities cross over and are not mutually exclusive. Latinx must use its sense of mixture and fluidity to amplify difference, racial or otherwise, to center women, Blackness, Indigenousness, and queerness, and not fall into the trap of what legal scholar Tanya Khateri Hernandez calls multiracial exceptionalism, which believes in Latinidad's version of white supremacy superiority to the Anglo version of white supremacy. So in other words, a cooler way of being white. That kind of exceptionalism would be the same trap of American exceptionalism, and the time for that is clearly over. Okay, that's the conclusion of my remarks, and I'm really listening. I'm really looking forward to see what Arlene has to say.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, wonderful. There's so much that I don't even want to say anything and just start engaging with Ed, particularly around his quote of Tanya Hernandez's and the cooler way of being white, right? We could unpack that all day and challenge this kind of multicultural exceptionalism that I think it's so important that we resist in the politics of Latinidad. So I also prepared some remarks, and I'm going to hopefully just go through them in less than 7 minutes, because I really want to go through the conversation. I'm going to turn the conversation to the initiative that we're actually seeing today, hoping that later Billy González will wrap it all together and make sense out of Ed's comments and what I'll share right now. I'll start by thanking the organizers and all who helped gather us today, and also by acknowledging that I speak to you from the ancestral lands of the Lenape, and encouraging all to think about the ancestral lands on which we stand. And also to congratulate the DePaul Art Museum for launching this necessary Latinx initiative that goes to the heart of what is needed right now and what is most central to the conversation around inclusivity. So I've organized some short remarks to highlight 3 elements of the Latin American exhibition and initiative that I hope serve as example to other art museum institutions that are similarly seeking to address the invisibility of Latinx populations in these spaces, especially within the context of university museums, as is the DePaul Art Museum. The first point I want to praise and really shout out is this initiative prioritizing the needs for structural transformation in museum collections and in the discipline of art history at large. From what I've read, the curators organized the exhibition as part of a larger initiative to achieve a more equitable and representative museum collection. And this alone places it at the vanguard beyond traditional approaches to representations that have primarily focused on multicultural symbolism rather than on structural reforms needed to bring about empowerment. As we all know, empowerment demands that museums not only exhibit our artists in temporary exhibitions that make us feel happy and seen, but that they also purchase and collect the works of Latinx artists and include their works in all museum collections. Only this can ensure that Latinx artists are part of the permanent archive of our institutions and that future generations can learn about Latinx artists more easily, independently of the will or interests of particular curators. Beyond purchasing and collecting the work of Latinx artists, this initiative also raises key questions about the relationship between university museums and the larger academic community and the public at large, and the centrality of hiring Latinx curators and Latinx visual studies faculty more broadly. It made me think about my own institution that has incredible museum, the Gray Art Museum, where there's no Latinx faculty involved, nobody in the collection. And it made me realize that the DePaul Museum is exactly where we should be turning our eyes to as examples. To ask, does your university or museum have enough Latinx faculty or curators to support the work you seek to do? Are there Latinx art and visual studies scholars in your faculty? And if there are none, what are you doing to fill in this key element of expertise? And if there are, how are you creating synergies and collaborations between the museum and the Latinx student community? And finally, how can we incorporate students in the work of university museums to ensure their access and professionalization in art fields? So to me, this issue is so central. How do we begin to hire the Latinx art and visual culture faculty to train new generations of Latinx visual culture studies scholars, especially within universities that are lucky to have renowned university museums and also Latinx studies faculty of international renown. And I saw earlier that we have here in the house, Frances Aparicio, Lourdes Torres, Delia Cosentino, and some of the other outstanding Latinx faculty at DePaul and University of and Chicago. So I think it's fantastic that these institutions are so uniquely suited to take leadership roles in the teaching and training of new curators and scholars. The second point I want to quickly comment on is this initiative's welcomed and timely emphasis on Chicago area artists and how effective this regional emphasis is for addressing issues of parity and inclusivity. In Latinx art, I documented one of the most problematic global trends most responsible for inequities in art worlds is the widespread focus on so-called nationally and globally authenticated artists. In other words, artists with similar trajectories in global cities like New York City, or with art-marketed coveted art school degrees, think here of the Fetish over Yale University graduates, for instance, which are then showered with an inordinate amount of attention. This trend has led to the rise of standardized collections, but also to an art star-based system based on the likes and tastes of powerful collectors, and ultimately to the marginalization of most artists of color, with some exceptions, and through a system that leaves the larger system unchanged. Another problematic outcome is the growing invisibility of Latinx artists beyond art global recognized centers, the question of Latinx art with New York City or Los Angeles, rather than with the diversity of Latinx communities across the United States, in other cities, but also in suburbs, in rural communities, and more. So focusing on Latinx artists could be the one way from this impasse, which is why I really appreciate the exhibition's healthy representation of Chicago-based artists alongside Latinx artists from across the United States. This move is especially prescient in a city where Latinx communities account for nearly 30% of the population, as is the case of Chicago, and where there's such a wealth of artists: Candida Alvarez, Lola Alvarez Bravo, Errol Ortiz, Harold Mendez, Erra Soto, Maria Gaspari, Beth Mallorca, and so many more, attesting to the national and international value of its art communities. This focus on regional artist communities can also help us achieve greater inclusivity and also challenge the dominant New York, LA-centric Latinx conversation that is so necessary to truly capture Latinx diversity, not only in ethnic and racial terms, but also across regions, which can in turn help us appreciate the role of geography and demographics in the making of different manifestations of Latinidad. The last key feature of this initiative that I wanted to comment and highlight, and that makes it a great model to follow, was its removal of national descriptors from the exhibition labels and its presentation of participating artists in more open-ended ways that encourage visitors to explore their individual backgrounds and trajectories. And here I'll tie into Ed's conversation around nationalism. And one way against that impasse is actually to avoid these descriptors. In Latinx art, I describe the fetish with national references in the art world and how much nationality indexes globality, sexiness, whiteness versus diaspora and US-based identifications, which are generally racialized. This tendency to nationalize artists has favored Latinx artists with national privilege, those born and raised in Latin America, but also curators, creatives, and more, instead of US-based and working Latinx artists, leading to huge exclusions and hierarchies, and particularly to white dominant Latin American creatives who come from middle-class backgrounds in Latin America and then occupy positions of Latinx representation in the United States. National privilege has also tended to anchor Latin America as a primary reference for archiving, exhibiting, and writing about the work of Latinx artists. What this exhibition shows is that getting rid of national identifiers opens up conversations around place, location, and region. It helps to anchor the diasporic experience of Latinx communities as American artists. It also turns our attention to artists' individual trajectories, where they were born, where they moved to, which communities they've been part of, and also what common tropes and topics may be at the heart of their work, whether it be identity, urban issues, race and sexuality, history, social movements, and more. And here, for instance, I loved seeing the work of Las Nietas de Nono from Puerto Rico with Harold Mendez. And for the young curator artist, for the young curatorial assistant who happened to be an artist, described the commonalities of these works around issues of conquest and colonization. And what a rare opportunity and great fruitful conversation to have these artists in conversation. When I compiled the appendixes for Latinx art, I did the same kind of move of getting rid of identifiers and instead highlighted where people were born, but also included a sample of organizations focusing on Latinx artists, whether it be primarily community organizations or people working in the digital realm of Instagram, to encourage people to learn and discover more artists on their own, but foremost to communicate what I think is so amply evident in this exhibition, which is very simple, that Latinx art, artists, and creativity is everywhere around us, and that it is time that we focus that we focus institutional resources to elevate it and ensure future generations of students are never again ignorant of the creativity and value. So to conclude, the Latin American exhibition provides a Latinx American exhibition provides a wake-up call to all university museums and a launching pad for more detailed exhibitions beyond the survey format, exploring the diversity within the diversity that exists in Latinx art. I also look forward to learning more about the new curatorial assistants, most of them which were students, who were part of the exhibition, and to the cutting-edge exhibition and programs they will do next. Because programs like this cannot ever be a fad. They have to be a structural component of every university museum. They have to be the future. So thank you, and I look forward to Bill's conversations.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. I wanted to thank both Ed and Arlene for their wonderful and really thought-provoking comments. I just wanted to point out three possibilities of sort of common themes, and then move into some questions in our discussion. One was that I was struck that both of you talked about the idea of Latinx as opportunity in multiple ways. On the one hand, Latinidad and the concept of Latinx presents, I think Ed mentioned the idea of Latinx being an identity that in some ways challenges identity, right? Or it creates the opportunity of moving beyond a fixed identity. or moving beyond the racial binaries of the United States, which offer sort of two choices for identity. And Latinx's illegibility within that system, right, creates opportunities for other potential racial identifications. So there's a sort of good side of Latinidad as a sort of horizon of opportunity for progressive coalition. And then on the other hand, Latinidad also as the appeal of a new market to dominant market structural forces in the United States who are seeking to codify and classify and make money. And another point was the dangers, I think, of the misleading nature or the duplicity. I'm trying to think of maybe the best way to describe that, of different racial orders and forms of racial identification in Latin America versus the United States. So that we have the concept of mestizaje, for example, as a kind of national ideal, right, of racial mixture and racial harmony, which allows, as Arlene was pointing out, privileged Latin Americans who are really white, who are have a kind of privilege of the national and are able to benefit from a variety of economic and material structures in their home countries, to come to the United States and displace any kind of recognition of US Latinos in the United States. So, but by virtue of being Latin American, at the same time, right, count as exotic within art markets, right? Count as having that kind of cachet. So I just thought those were sort of interesting possibilities to have in the background from the remarks that you've already made. But I kind of wanted to start with a really simple question, and perhaps I've already raised some questions that you could respond to, but I wanted to start with a question that Yonit suggested about the potential for creating a national museum of Latinos in Washington, and what you think about this idea, what you would like to see included, and what potential problems you might already see on the horizon about it.
I'll let Arlene take that one.
Very quickly. Well, I'm a fan. I just think we do need more museums. Our students need to be hired simply just for that reason. But the truth is that yeah, I've also been critical of the initiative in Cultural Works in 2008. I wrote a little bit about some of my concerns, which briefly is that, this is an initiative that was spearheaded by business people, celebrities, and politicians, right? Part of it because, it was the work of advocating and, you need to have, I guess, people at the table, right? Like the Eva Longorios of the world. The interesting thing starts now, right? And the key element will be to ensuring that we have Latinx scholars, but also diverse Latinx scholars at the table, historians, art historians, all types of scholars from different regions, because this is that's the one thing that's been missing in the conversation, and this is really where everything starts. And the only way to move forward is to ensuring that you have the expertise of scholars. The Smithsonian is a scholar institution, so I have my hope that will happen. But beyond that, I think that this is an initiative that we should all support. I'm very excited. I'll leave it at that.
I would just say that there's a lot of pressure for there to be just one museum right now, and then there's the danger of the Disneyfication of some weird idea of Latinx culture, which Arlene actually wrote about in her book about the gentrification of East Harlem. She talked about this project that they brought up, which was designed by these people in LA to do something in New York. You remember, you can talk about that. that sort of created this ersatz idea about what Latino culture would be like. I mean, I'm sure that this would have more historical stuff, but I just worry about what forces would be shaping, the aesthetic.
I also feel that, we have the example of the Museum of African-American Art and History and Culture, which is great because that museum already exists, and they really had to work through a lot of these issues, particularly the issue of how do you tell a story, right, with accuracy, because a lot of the Smithsonian, these are national museums, so they have to tell a story that is national, right, a assimilation story that, well, there was slavery, but we all get along kind of thing, because it is part of the national ideology canon of, the American museums that tourists from all over the world see. So a key element, I think, my big warning would be be to ensure that we get to tell the story with the same care, nuance, and rigor that the African-American curators were able to do for their museum, and that we don't try to fit into this, you know, squeaky clean, aspirational Latinidad, right? That we know a lot of our middle classes are dying to fall for in order to fit in and be accepted into the American canon. We need to be able to tell the stories of lynching in the Southwest. We need to be telling the stories of the darkest parts of the Latinx history.
Absolutely. Perhaps kind of connected with that idea, there's a way in which Latinidad is, you know, the metaphors that were offered tonight are really about, you know, multiple coalitions or multiple identities that have to kind of come together. There's a lot about making the political choice, right, to come together under our own terms without having that sort of imposed from above. And I guess I'd like to ask about the geographical, and in some ways you've already kind of touched on this a little bit in your remarks, Arlene, but the kind of geographical diversity of different expressions of Latinidad, and the way in which, as you know, Francis Aparicio has recently argued in a book, in the United States and sometimes in major cities, but really all throughout the US, people from various Latino groups are really commingling, that there isn't necessarily the sense of sort of single national flavors in quite the same way anymore, as the demographic explosion, right, of the Latino population has happened in the United States, and people are interacting in the US. So how do we strike that balance between the kind of, as you were describing, the specificity of certain historical narratives of different groups, right? But at the same time, the national diversity and the increasing mixture among all of the different groups? It's a big question.
Again, you want me to take that again?
You're leaning forward. No, I mean, I'll respond.
Yeah. No, I agree that, and that's actually, I have to say, Billy, that's one of the most exciting moments in Latinx studies right now. I think that we are at a moment where we're going against any kind of, you know, I think we spent a lot of time, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were looking at the whole processes of Latinization, a lot of research into, like, you know, how do you get Latinx identities, right? And those processes that focused on, you know, the political, the social, the cultural processes of unity, right? Whether it's made up by corporations, by political movements, whatever it was. We're at a moment of untangling, and we're perhaps in the most exciting moment there is in Latinx studies, which is where we're like, hey, let's really look closely at all of the marginalized spaces, identities that were really not looked at as carefully as we should have, because we were just paying attention to the pan-Latinidad process, right? So you have Afro-Latinx studies, critical indigeneities, a huge turn and attention to geography and to regional differences, among many other spaces. Of course, the queer studies, trans conversation. And I think that that's what's exciting, you know, and why works like Ed's are so important, because we're both saying, you know, there's nothing, you know, people are like, wait, but that's too scary. That means that Latinidad doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, wait, Latinidad can only make sense if we part and we center these conversations. If we don't center these identities and these marginalized identities and begin to anchor race and indigeneity, then might as well just throw it away. Because then what you have is this, you know, multicultural exclusivity, you know, all this that we don't want. Nobody wants anymore. We spent a whole decade or more highlighting how those processes of Latinidad led to whiteness and cooptation. And I think it's very important that we, you know, the moment that we're in, and part of that is absolutely realizing that we cannot have an exhibition of Latinx art that only has Los Angeles and New York. Hell no. Chicago is a perfect example of this. You know, the initiative you've done is a great example, I feel, because you have really woven the local artists with artists from all over the United States, and you've done it, and also Puerto Rico, and done it in a way that is rigorous, exciting, and that does tell a story and doesn't feel forced.
Thanks. Ed?
There's definitely more political power, but not just in conventional politics, but just in the power that we have in our own fields, you know, by making alliances between different Latino groups, or, you know, we fall into the fragmentation that Arlene talks about. And there are things that bring us together, you know, like the older, you know, the older kind of 70s ideas, like US has interfered with or invaded almost all Latin American countries. This is again like the Juan González thesis of what drives Latin American migration, it's US intervention. And again, you know, identity formation goes both ways. It's something that's, as you mentioned, Bill, something that's imposed and something that there's a reaction against. And that imposition often is a specific kind of sets of racism, racism about mixed race appearance, or racism about not speaking English correctly, or racism about foreignness, right? So these are particular things that Latinos can coalesce around. And, you know, I would just say that, I mean, you know, nationalism is also problematic as well. I mean, how is it that, you know, we got, you know, people from LA and New York of any stripe, you know, feeling one national identity. And then if you look at Asian Americans are trying to assert themselves, and they speak all these different languages and are from really different parts of the world. So, you know, we're faced with these roles that were, you know, unfortunately inscribed on us by the nature of geopolitics. So we might as well respond.
I appreciate both of you putting kind of intersectional politics and an emphasis on racial difference at the center of the work that you do. So I think that's really great. Ionit, I know that we had a schedule, and I know you probably want to turn to questions from the chat. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much to the three of you. I want to get to the questions that we've been getting in the chat, just so we have time. I'll start by reading Daniel Killis' question, and I'll read it. I want to thank both Arlene and Ed for their books, which are proving to be invaluable teaching resources for myself and many others. I want to draw attention to the recent passing of David Medalla and Guy Brett, who are tireless advocates for the international legitimacy of Latin American art. Arlene, in your book, you draw a stark distinction between a Latin American art that you characterize as a differentiated sphere with little overlap with Latinx art. Yet you also suggest that artists born in Latin America who work in the US and address issues pertinent to communities here count as Latinx artists. I'm wondering if there are advantages in not drawing such a radical opposition between Latin American and Latinx art so that areas of solidarity can be found and celebrated, particularly as regards rising discussions around feminism, trans rights, and racism in Latin America.
Yes and no. And because I think theoretically, you know, the idea of hemispheric unity between Latinx and Latin American studies, I mean, who of us has not promulgated that idea of hemispheric unity? And, you know, the whole kind of like, you know, and then realizing that both Latinx and Latin American studies have histories, right? And they're located in particular fields, they have different resources. And when you think about Latinx and Latin American art, I thought it was important to really not to go beyond the more theoretical arguments of unity and really see how things actually work on the ground. And that's where the ethnographic method kind of helps, because, you know, when you read the theories, like, oh, how wonderful that, of course, we have to take a transnational approach. But then when you actually look at what's happening on the ground, that's when you see the incredible investment and disinvestment, in particular, you know, in Latinx art versus Latin American art. So I think it was important for me to really pay attention to the political economy, the economics, right, behind that are creating those distinctions, right? These distinctions, I agree, are, you know, they're not stark, they're made to be stark, so that there are artists in the United States that have been here for 50 years, Liliana Porter, Carmen Herrera, so many that are still regarded as Latin American because there's a value to those categories that Latinx does not. So I think, and I want to highlight another question before that talks about my critique of globalization. I don't criticize globalization. I criticize cosmopolitan globalization. This is not the globalization of an artist like Beatriz Cortez. Am I saying her last name right? Guatemalan Cortez, right? Beatriz, who is very transnational, right? But her politics of transnationality and globalization are very much anti-racist, right? I'm critiquing the cosmopolitan globalization of Latin American art that revolves around national fairs, elites, and distinguishing from Latinx communities, right? I don't know if that makes any sense here, but the point here is to we need to really, just like Latinx has to be peeled, right? There's an onion here. We can assume we have to really see what it is, how is it used. We need to be very careful about the uses of hemispheric studies, the uses of globalization and solidarity, to be very, very attentive to who benefits and who's left out. And after we've had those conversations and we have answers that are equitable, then we could jump again and talk about hemispheric studies and if you read the book, you'll see that what I do in the book is I wish for those distinctions too. I would love to go to Latin America and see them collect Latinx artists. I never saw any Latinx artists in museums in Buenos Aires, in Colombia, anywhere I visited. So when I see that happening, right, like that would be my dream. My dream would be is that these distinctions, that solidarities really played out at the level of structural investments that would allow us to really be equal in the art world and the art market.
I just want to give the opportunity to Joanna Talavani, who you responded to, and Daniel Quiles, if they want to add anything brief to what Arlene just said. Okay. The next question is from Nicole Zambrano. And they ask, what do you think about a future where we dismantle Latinidad in the US by forming individual identities that allow for the Afro-Latinx and indigenous peoples to be focus of the conversation instead of the white passing Latinx members, which you talked a little bit about, but maybe you want to add something else.
It's a project that is valid like any other, assertion of identity. There's always going to be contestation of identity at whatever level that you create it. I felt that it would be positive for a lot of people who consider themselves Latinx to begin with, to work within an identity that centered Black and Indigenous people, or entered into dialogue. So the idea of dismantling, the thing is that I don't really know what Latinidad is, so I don't know what's being dismantled. If you're saying a white hegemonic version of Latinidad, that's one version of Latinidad among many that have existed. So I'm not sure what that is that you're calling for to be dismantled. But I think that clearly the colonial wound falls most heavily on all the marginalized groups that we've mentioned so far.
And that is a good segue to the next question we got from James Estrada. Many of the artists in the DePaul exhibit are also digging into colonial and indigenous histories and bringing symbols and objects into their own visual and textural worlds. They're doing a kind of history or a retelling of history through the lens of their contemporary stories. What is the responsibility, or rather the opportunity, for those who create original visual work to do that kind of entanglement of Latinidad, especially when the history is hard and complicated to deal with, specifically some kind of a postmodern retelling of colonial, for example, Spanish art?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I think that, your question basically is an assertion, and I would agree with you. And I think it is fantastic that you see artists engaging in those kinds of retelling of histories, especially because the archive, as we know, right, is so is oftentimes not there. I'm thinking, for instance, of a short conversation I had with Glendales Medina, who's Puerto Rican from the Bronx, and talking about, who uses a lot of Taino in her work, and this, how can you go back to just, what's the book, Historia de Puerto Rico 18 whatever by Fran, I forget. The records were written by colonial, right? How do you retell and change and remake it? We need we need artists to reimagine, right, the archives, and we need artists to not only dig but help us tell better stories. And I actually find the kind of that kind of work very exciting and very inspiring, because it's kind of at the vanguard, I believe, of what you see in literature, right? The work of African-American literary scholars who are using a more kind of fictional attention or fictional approach to working with the archives, because the archives are not going to get us, are not going to give us the substance of what we need. They're not going to be empowering. They're not going to be, because they come from the perspective of the oppressors. So I think that's what I find most exciting, and I encourage artists to continue in that route and in that, because we need that. We need those perspectives to be produced. And I was thinking, I'm sorry, the artist I meant was Beatriz Cortez, of course, but she's not Guatemalan, she's Salvadorian, so my mistake. Thanks to Olga for clarifying this. It's so wonderful, by the way, to see so many people here and to see names, which is so rare in these Zoom situations. So thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I'm happy also if you would like to speak and unmute yourself, and also I invite everyone in the last few minutes to turn your cameras on, just so we feel we're in the same room. We just got another question by Ramon Miranda Beltran, and the question says, if we were to call the history of the United States a history that starts from exclusion to inclusion, fast forward to 2021, that inclusion has not happened. It's hard for me to understand how can we push towards an inclusion to the national dialogue without demanding or taking reparations and the return of the stolen land. Then there is the issues of Puerto Rico as a colony of the United States. My question is how an organization towards those goals looks like, if you can imagine it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I argue in my book, Fantasy Island, which is about the Puerto Rico debt crisis, among a lot of other things, is that Puerto Rico should receive reparations. Of course, it's tricky because there's a ruling elite in Puerto Rico, and I'm not sure how much they deserve reparations, but definitely people who are marginalized, who are Puerto Rican, and everyone else who has been historically marginalized and not allowed the same mechanisms for wealth accumulation that certain groups do. I agree. I think that the politics of inclusivity can ring hollow if there's not a systemic change that includes, really attacking the problem with structural wealth inequality.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why Ed and I have known each other and agreed on many things for a good 20 years, is because we ultimately pay a lot of attention to issues of the economy and empowerment and structural economic equitable. I mean, I think that that's central to any conversation of empowerment, is to really address the structural, the economy, that's so, and to go beyond any kind of symbolic reparation or representation that's not accompanied by real support, economic support.
And I think we're in a situation right now where, you really got to watch what's going on, particularly within the Democratic Party, in terms of these issues and the kind of token inclusivity that's being thrown around. I would like to see it followed up with real material results.
We have a few more minutes and welcome any final questions or thoughts. Billy, if you have any questions left also, welcome your questions.
I would love to hear from a student.
Are you going to give them extra credit?
I can see some of my students, so I hope that they will pipe up.
You could call on one of them.
No pressure.
I also see some artists in the audience. I see Yvette and I see Viviana. So it would be great to hear from you guys too.
Hello, I'm here too. This is Moses. I had a quick question about the text of Latinx in terms of, you know, in 20 or 30 years of being the Latinos are going to be a majority in the United States, and how this idea will grow or change as it has grown and changed in the past to, you know, to another, I don't know, another reflection of what we are and what we will be.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the problem with whether Latinos are a majority is because there's a lot of people who get counted as Latinos who aren't necessarily marginalized, and also there's a lot of Afro-Latinos who really live functionally as African-Americans, and so it's that number has always been, you know, odd for me. But certainly there's a growing presence, and you know, in a place like California, it's majority not, what is it, what Hispanic, yeah, which does not include non-Hispanic whites. So you know, there's an opportunity for some kind of representation to produce you know, discourse that that allows us to maybe be more integrated into, you know, what's going on here, because there's definitely there's change coming up. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but
I mean, I also want to think about the work of my colleague Cristina Beltran, right? And which asks recently, you know, what do we do of, you know, the Latino insurrectionists, right? Who are also part of the Trump conspiracy and all of that. I believe Tanya, there's one Taino, whatever, that is Latinx, Cuban American, I believe, or so. And also the fact that there's many, not only Latinx people, but also people of color of different, who've shown any kind of Latinx or also ethnic identification, with the understanding that those identifications are divisive and they're because of what they want to be seen as American, right? There's another conversation of the politics of whiteness that are also very much in play in our community, right? So that's why I think it's great to perhaps end with the question of, I think it was a student who highlighted, why don't we just dismantle it and center Afro-Latinx and Indigenous Latinx, right? And I will say that, you know, my answer to that is that because Latinx as an identity has historically been racialized in the United States in the context of a larger imaginary. And there's a history by which, while we may separate, while we may distinguish, right, Afro-Latinx and Indigenous Latinx, in the context of the American imaginary, right, there's, as long as there is a Latinx identity that people will be racializing or distinguishing, if it doesn't really matter what you identify with, if you are ultimately like this guy, for instance, Taino, whatever his name is, that he could say he's a Trump supporter, he's white, but you know, I don't know if he's not wearing his insurrectionist gear, if he would not be racialized. You know, he can control that. because we're living in a larger context where Latinx identities are racialized one way or the other. So that's where the politics of solidarity and of radical solidarity, and for centering anti-racism in Latinidad and Latinx politics, and to see Latinx as a project that centers anti-racism and that centers racial identities and Afro-Latinx and Indigenous Latinx is a better way to go, because it provides us with a bigger category around which we could become more powerful against this monster that is white supremacy that already is co-opting many in our community, right? Many in our community who wants to buy onto that project of whiteness.
Don't forget the disinformation too, in Spanish language media in Florida.
Well, since you called the artist, so I guess I'll say something. Hi, I'm Bibiana. I actually have been thinking very recently, I had many questions that were already answered by your remarks at the beginning. But one question that continues to roam my head is that who owns the term Latinx? Because I have been hearing very similar debates that I heard in the late 80s and 90s with Hispanics and Latino. There was a class issue involved in it, and there was also a generational issue involved in it. An older generation that was more prosperous, perhaps whitened, that wanted that association with Spain. And then the more working class, grassroots person that wants to then be identified as Latino, because then it's a political position to move forward from. And then they've been mostly young people that has said to me that I couldn't call myself Latinx, because so there's a sense that Latinx also means young, that Latinx also means some kind of transgression of some kind. So it's not the big umbrella of inclusivity that we're speaking of in general term. There is a process here of exclusion and inclusion that is taking place. So what do we do with the previous generation that wants to partake into the Latinx conversation, but is being told that doesn't belong to us?
Ed, you take that one.
Oh, you know, it sounds like you had a personal interaction with someone, and I don't think there's a rule book or a guidebook that defines Latinx. And even my book really was not written with this in mind. I originally wanted to write a book about racial difference, and then my students began using this word Latinx. And I saw that there was a parallel between the indistinct racial identity that Latinx people often have and the indistinct gender identity that people who want to call themselves Latinx want to use. And I just saw it as something to point for the future. And I think a big problem is that nobody really has, there's no rules, there's no Latinidad that exists. I mean, there's no canon, there's no constitution of Latinidad that needs to be overthrown. It's just people talking. And, you know, I feel sorry that, you know, someone said that to you, but it's not necessarily true. It's just a conversation. And if you feel like it's you want to look towards the future, maybe Latinx is a good term. If you feel like you want to embrace LGBTQ people around you, you know, which is something, one of the reasons I did is because I have several family members who are LGBTQ, and I've experienced the pain that they've suffered when they couldn't bring their partners to family gatherings. So I feel in solidarity with that. What are you going to say?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I also think it's important that we realize that words and terms are just words and terms, and they're totally empty without a social movement and a politics behind that. period. So that's really what it's about. And, I like to think we used to be Hispanic, then used to be Latino, now it's Latinx. And in the future, who knows? Because these terms, right, represent a particular social movement, right? We're at a moment when the X is raising a lot of questions, right? And that's what's exciting about it, because it is bringing attention to marginalized identities, but also to race, and it's making us all like, what is that, right? How awesome is that we're asking these questions when we spend like at least 15 years with like commercial Latinidad that was already unrecognizable to us, right? So I always say that, when Latinx no longer raises questions and becomes subversive, we should come up with a new term. Because, terms are they're part of social movements. And if they're not useful for social movements that are asking questions, then, they shouldn't exist. So, and I think our community is mature enough and, and growing and global and exciting and all of that to take all of those conversations.
I want to make sure that we get to 2 more questions because we're past our time, but Joanna Talavani, who's a student, is asking if you have any must-have books to recommend, besides the 2 of yours for sure, to further educate ourselves on these issues in our community.
Oof. Well, I'm going to shout out the Latinx Studies Journal, which is published, the editor Lourdes Torres is here, and also the Diálogo Journal, and the editor is our dear friend, Billy Johnson González, who's our moderator. I would just really read those journals, because I find those journals have the latest of the latest. You will find all the most cutting edge work by young people, by young scholars. Even before they publish their books, they will have an article in Diálogo, they'll have an article in Latinx Studies Journal. And if there's something that intrigues you, oh my God, then you pick up the book. Your chances are you're going to find the book. For instance, Latinx Studies had a beautiful critical indigeneities forum where, right, you could then, all of the authors in that book, in that forum had individual books you could read if you're interested in the topic of critical indigeneities, and so forth and so forth. So I'll just shout out to journals just for today instead of books.
I just blurbed this book by Laura Gomez, Inventing Latinos, which is about politics, and I enjoyed that, but that's just merely about the label. I also have been reading this book by Erica Edwards about Black women in Argentina, which is really, really good.
Also read the Black Latinas Know blog, the Black Latinas Know Collective. You should follow their blog. And you should read all the digital publication from interventions in the Latinx Project too. And Latinx Spaces from, who publishes Latinx Spaces? I forget, Bill. But yes, there's a lot of great blogs right now. But the Black Latinas Know Collective is the bomb.
There's also Latinx Talk, I think, another blog that you can apply to be on.
That's what I love about the moment, is that not only is Latinx Studies asking really great questions about specificity, but we have a real moment of public humanities where all of us are tweeting, all of us are writing blogs, because we want to, Latinx Studies is about communities, it's about having solidarity. It's not about just traditional scholarship. So it's really fascinating that people are not just writing traditional things, but there's also an ongoing exciting public humanities, digital initiatives, websites, archives, and of course, social media, Twitter, Instagram, become spaces for archiving and communicating our own research too.
Thank you. Yes, there were other recommendations in the chat, so make sure to check there. And I thought there was a hand raised, but I don't see it anymore. So maybe the person took it back. Oh, there it is. Camelia Moore. If you want to unmute yourself, yes.
Hi, yeah. So I took my hand away when I realized that there was not a lot of time left. So, but I'm back. I'm a student at ISU, and heard about this talk from my professor. I'm taking a WGS class in Latinx Studies, and the focus that we're on is culture and pop culture for the unit. And we're reading an article by you, Arlene Dávila, called Culture, and we've been trying to figure out exactly what that means in the context of Latinidad and Latinx. And I feel like a lot of my questions have been answered here, but one thing I'm kind of wondering is like how you understand the influence of pop culture on how people are coming to terms with what Latinidad means. Because I feel like pop culture has such a huge influence on everyone, but when I'm trying to, I guess, determine what pop culture is, I really don't know. And I really don't know how to differentiate it between culture. And at least like, I don't know. Those are the things that I'm trying to wrap my head around as I'm reading your text. So I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts about that you would mind sharing.
Yeah, I think the key element that I wanted to highlight is, instead of thinking of culture as a thing and a static thing, is to think of it as a process. And it's a very good old fashioned Gramscian, right, hegemony, popular culture, insight that really if we're any kind of cultural realm, any kind of cultural product, any kind of, and that refers to the label Latinx, right? It's just, it's not a thing. It's a process of cultural struggles. And it's in that process that it could be understood. And the meaning of Latinx or whatever it is only comes about from the movements and the politics in which it is affiliated or associated with, right? So that there's no such thing. And that's why Ed says, I don't know what Latinidad is, because what he's telling you, there's not one fixed meaning, right? So you could think about the whitewash project of Latinidad, but you could also think about the Latinx, racialized Latinx project that we all hope to be part of, right? As a different type of Latinidad. So it's in the politics that imply, that give meaning to those identities and to that cultural, whatever culture is, that's actually the most exciting process. And I don't know if this helps you, but the important thing is to go away from trying to fix a meaning, right? That's not as interesting as the process around which different meanings emerge. So I think that's what I would tell you, is in your classes to just focus on describing, right, the different processes and the changes and the politics behind meaning making, because words are just words. And if that doesn't make any sense, we can follow up on a one-to-one at another time.
Oh, wow, thank you so much. That really helped me put it into perspective better. And I appreciate the invitation. That's so awesome.
We have one more question. Are you okay with one more question, Ed and Arlene? Yes? Okay, last one, promise, by Yvette Mayorga. And Yvette asks, how can we further expand the inclusion of Latinx in rural US, especially the Midwest? I come from rural meatpacking US and continue to see the separation between Latinx who grew up in the metropolitan cities like Chicago and their inclusion in scholarship, etc., including myself now as an artist living in Chicago.
Yeah, well, it's a term, go ahead, sorry.
No, Ed, continue, I'm sorry.
It's a term that people who are not in the metropolitan centers can have a difficulty grasping because they don't understand what the symbolism is of it. But words can catch on with people. But that's one. I'm glad to bring that up, because that's one of the criticisms about Latinx, is that it's used by an elite and it doesn't relate to everyday people. And I think that in some ways it's largely true. I was in London a year or so ago to do that thing with the British Academy, and I went to interview people who were trying to identify with Latinx in London, and a lot of them were part of an intellectual elite, but they insisted that the word had a lot of resonance in working class queer spaces. So I think that a key is understanding people's multiple identifications in terms of gender and sexuality.
I also want to say that, Yvette, you know, the most important thing is that, you know, is also what you could do, because, you know, you're also an artist, right, who has shown in New York and has shown elsewhere. And it's always great to just, you know, maybe curate a show, right? Or whenever you get an exhibition or an invitation. And I'll say this to any of the artists, you know, I know a lot of you guys already do that. I saw Edra Soto already before, and I know she curates a lot of shows with local artists. So that would be kind of my, and also with curators, right? I mean, so it's an ongoing problem, but I think all of us need to address it. All of us need to address it by ensuring that whenever we do any kind of exhibition or work, there are always artists that are, right, from, as you know, as diverse as we can, right? It's a responsibility we need to have, but also whenever local artists, whenever any of you get exhibitions, I really welcome you to educate the curators you work with and the directors you work with and the people you work with, because chances are they don't know more artists from, you know, Midwest Chicago or rural communities, and you have a chance to educate them. And I'm sure they will be so happy, because, you know, they want that. They want to know more artists. So I don't know if that responds to your question, Yvette, but I am in total solidarity and happy to help you with that goal, because it's also a big concern of mine.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Arlene, Ed, Billy, for all of you for staying here, for joining us. This was a really fantastic conversation. And at DPAM, we feel very honored and lucky to be able to host this and many other programs coming up. So I hope you have a good evening and stay warm.